Hello, today we're going to be talking about arguments from evil. In particular, we'll be discussing arguments against the existence of God. There are two versions that we'll be discussing, both of which are arguments from evil, and then we'll close by summarizing. So far we've examined several arguments in favor of the existence of God, and we're now going to turn our attention to arguments that purport to show there is no such thing as God in the conception that we have on the table here in this class. In particular, our discussions will be trading on the existence of gratuitous evil and how that runs into conflicts with the existence of a benevolent God, in particular an omnibenevolent God. Before we get started, as we typically do, it'll be useful to define some terms. Term of importance here will be possible world. So W is a possible world if and only if W is metaphysically possible way in which the actual universe could have been. For example, it's metaphysically possible that John had hair on his head. I do not, by the way. But it's metaphysically possible that I did. A useful way to talk about this is by saying there's a possible world representing John having hair on his head. It's the same as this world in all respects, except for in that world I have hair. That's a possible world. Now, clearly there is an infinite number of possible worlds because there's an infinite number of ways this world could have actually been. This actual world, the world in which we live, is just one of those possible worlds among all the infinite. We're going to use this little @ symbol to mean the actual world out of all the infinite. Now, an omniscient God would know about all of the infinite possible worlds, and an omnipotent God could create any of them. And, importantly here, an omnibenevolent God would always prefer the best possible world to any other. That's important. That leads us to our first argument from evil. Here's how it goes. If God exists, then the actual world was created by an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, that is a triple O, being. If the actual world was created by a triple O being, then the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. If the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, then the actual world contains no evil. Hence, if God exists, then the actual world contains no evil. Of course, the actual world does contain evil, so God does not exist. This is valid. 1 through 3, as you see, jumps through some steps in modus ponens, or just multiple applications of modus ponens, resulting in 4. 5 is the negation of the consequent of line 4, and so 6 follows by modus tollens as the negation of the antecedent of line 4. So that is valid. Is it sound, though? Let's think about the premises. So premise 1 seems just definitional. If God exists as we understand him, God is this triple O entity, and so that seems right. Line 2 requires a little more spelling out, so let's do that. Suppose the actual world was created by a triple O being. Then this being knows about all the possible worlds and can create any of them and prefers the best. And so this is the best of all possible worlds because this is the world that the triple O being created. Now, we should also say something about line 3. If the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, then the actual world contains no evil. So suppose it is the case that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. If the actual world contained evil, then there would be another world that was better than it, namely one that lacked evil. And so from that, it's supposed to follow that the actual world does not contain any evil. Of course, we all know that the actual world does contain evil. That's part of the issue. Now, some reject line 5, though. Some say you are confused. There is no evil. In fact, the actual world does not have any evil in it. This is a false premise. That is, what appears to us as evil, they say, is not actually evil, but a lack of goodness. And lacking goodness isn't evil. It's just neutral. So there's no evil, so they say. In response, we can just restate the argument in terms of an absence of goodness. So we'll say something like the actual world contains a lot of absences of goodness, but a better world would contain more good and fewer absences of good. And so the argument actually runs through the same, even if you understand evil as the absence of goodness. This is, again, inconsistent with the existence of an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent God. We might instead object to line 5 by arguing that evil is an illusion. That is, what appears to us as evil is actually good, but our perspectives are so limited that we cannot discern this. Now, in response, it seems implausible. I mean, murder, torture, institutional slavery, etc. seem clearly bad. The above objection entails that these phenomena are actually good, and we're mistaken about our assessment of those things being bad. Moreover, this objection entails that we're frequently deceived about what is bad, and God knows this because God knows everything. Isn't it bad that we're deceived? Not according to this objection. That evil is an illusion, as an objection to line 5 just seems on the face of it quite implausible. That said, some object to line 3, arguing that good actually requires evil. This is the evil is metaphysically necessary objection. That is, it's metaphysically impossible for God to create a world that has good but contains no evil, because good requires evil. Now, here's a simple example, a silly example, right? Exercise is good for health, but it can be painful, right? It's just as a matter of fact, the laws of nature are such that things are set up that way. Now, of course, that example wouldn't generalize to the case of metaphysical necessity, because the laws of nature could be different and it could not be painful, in fact, to exercise and be healthy. But, you might generalize this, at least on the face of it. It's not implausible to think that it is, in fact, necessary for there to be good, that there is evil. And it's not at all, even if you're not willing to go that far, it's not at all obvious that good requires evil, but then again, it's not at all obvious that good doesn't. So that's kind of where we stand. This may be a good objection. It's one that we should take seriously, and that leads us into the second argument from evil. In the second argument of evil, we keep that in mind. It may be the case that it's metaphysically necessary for there to be evil in the world for good to exist. So, similar argument. If God exists, then the actual world was created by a triple O being. If the actual world was created by a triple O being, then the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. So far, that's nothing new. Here's where the new stuff comes. If the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, then the actual world contains no more evil than the best of all possible worlds. So it's no worse. That allows for the possibility of there being evil in the actual world, just no more than the best of all possible worlds has. Hence, if God exists, then the actual world contains no more evil than the best of all possible worlds. Now, line 5 is that the actual world does, in fact, contain more evil than the best of all possible worlds, so God does not exist. Now, let's spell out some of these, because we know it's valid, but we've got to see if it's sound. So, line 3. Since 1 and 2 are the same, nothing new there. Line 3 we should say a little bit more about. If the actual world is the best of all possible worlds, and the actual world has the same properties as the best of all possible worlds, and if the best of all worlds has evil in some amount, we'll call it E, then it follows by Leibniz's law, so does the actual world. So that seems right, like just as a matter of logic. Now, more contestable, or at least something requiring a little more justification, is going to be line 5. The actual world, according to proponents of this line, contains unredeemed evil. An example, what good does a fawn burning in a forest fire facilitate? We can imagine a world just like ours without that sort of suffering. There seems to be all sorts of suffering, in fact, in the world that doesn't seem to be necessary. Like what good comes from the dinosaurs dying? Like what good comes from people alone, depressed, and contemplating terrible actions? Like what is the good that comes out of this? It's not at all obvious. And in fact, it's easy to imagine worlds in which everything is the same as ours, but those moments of suffering and moments of bad just aren't there. Now, some object to line 5 by arguing that free will requires evil, and this is known as the free will defense. That is, free will is a great good, they say, but allows for significant evil, and the actual world is a world in which agents have free will, but the only evil permitted is that required owing to that free will. In response, we can say that we can imagine a world in which agents have free will, but the evil consequences of their actions do not manifest. For example, God could have made it so that Hitler experienced, for instance, that his minions were committing atrocities without those events actually occurring. He could have been something like a brain in vat, or better, I think a better analogy would be something like in a playpen. Exercising free will has it, but, a little cushioned insofar as what you can actually affect on the world. Now, such a world would have free will, but it would be better than our own, because such evil and suffering did not occur. This is incidentally called the playpen response. There's another to consider. Consider this now. There is significant natural evil in the actual world. That is evil that is not caused by agents with free will, such as earthquakes or tsunamis. As I mentioned, a fawn burning alive in a forest or owing to natural evil seems evil unrelated to free will. Like, what good does this have to do? And I know you might think, well, look, brush fires and whatnot, they're causing new growth, flames and blazes. It's all part of nature. But yeah, the scenario I'm imagining is just a fawn, a deer, a baby deer, just in a forest by itself. It got captured, it got caught by the flames, that is, and it is burning alive. Now, what good does that serve? What purpose is that fulfilling? Has nothing to do with free will. That seems a sort of suffering that's unaccounted for in the free will defense. This is, incidentally, the natural evil response. Now, I'm going to summarize. I've gone through a bit of the dialectic here. Let me tie it all together for you. We've examined two arguments against the existence of God. The first claimed the best world contains no evil, and the second allowed for some. Now, if either argument is sound, then God doesn't exist. The strongest objection to these arguments is that the best world requires significant evil in the actual world, in particular, free will. However, it's unclear why the best world requires suffering from natural disasters unrelated to something like free will or unredeemed good, or something that's unredeemed by good consequences. And without an explanation, these arguments against the existence of God seem to have force. Now, as a matter of dialectic, I don't have a slide for this, so if you're still listening, keep on. But look, as a matter of dialectic, here's how it goes down. I've given you a battery of arguments in favor of the existence of God. I've given you a couple of arguments against the existence of God. If you think any of the arguments in favor of the existence of God are sound, the conclusion is that God exists. If you think any of the arguments against the existence of God are sound, then you think you should hold that God does not exist. Now, if you are on balance, if there does not seem to be any more sound arguments or any more powerful sound arguments in favor of God's existence than against, then you should be agnostic, because you do not know which. You cannot lean on any evidence that tells in favor of either of those propositions. Now, on the other hand, if you find that, say, for example, none of the arguments for the existence of God are sound, but maybe this argument or one of these arguments of evil is sound, then you should maintain a position of atheism. That is to say, you have more evidence that there is no God based on that argument, or based on the way the dialectics have gone, than you would, or than you do that there is a God. Now, on the other hand, if you think that the arguments in favor of God's existence are sound, or at least some of them are, and you think that the arguments against the existence of God are not sound, then presently you should be leaning towards theism, because in that case you would have more evidence from these arguments that God exists than you would that God doesn't.